Good afternoon, once again. Welcome to this second afternoon session, and welcome to John Stoner from Cisco, who will tell us about how we can be better defenders by channeling our worst adversary. You can pronounce it.
All right, thanks. All right, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Here's me, happy to talk about any of these topics afterwards, including the one at the very, very bottom. So happy to have those conversations. I'm going to dive straight into this because obviously we have 35 minutes, give or take. So in those next 35 minutes, we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about why we want to emulate the adversary, kind of share some of the process that I've kind of gone through as I've evolved this, and then provide the lessons learned, talk about some of the scars that we've had, some of the successes we've had, and so forth. Now, as we're talking about adversary emulation, there's a number of different ways that you can do this, and there's a number of different things that you might want to accomplish depending upon your focus. I'm going to kind of set the scene here that the thing that we were trying to focus on was detection. Right? You could do emulation, prevention, response, forensics. In fact, we did a little bit of that in here and there over multiple years, but the premise of this is going to be really around detection, and you may be wondering why. From our perspective, what we were focused on was we were focusing on identifying the blind spots that you might have in your enterprise, right? If I can eliminate those blind spots, right, I could hunt for those things. If I can hunt for those things, hopefully I can evolve those things into detections that my operations teams, my SOCs, my SIMs can go ahead and detect on. That's kind of the premise around what we're working on. For those who were in Joe's threat hunting talk the day before, we talked about not wanting to hunt over and over and over for the same things. We want to be able to go ahead and build a repeatable process where possible. The other part of this I want to kind of set the stage around was the adversary development piece. Now, a number of different ways that you can emulate the adversary, a number of different personas that you can go ahead and work with. Insider, nation-state, cybercrime, choose your favorite. The focus that I'm going to take with this is talking about nation-state, and that was kind of where this is coming from. Now again, if that's not the threat model that you're focused on, utilize some of these different other personas, no problem. So, where do we start? Well, we started off with a nation-state that will remain unnamed, but we focused on a couple of basic TTPs. We talked about spear phishing as being a good place to start as we were kind of getting our feet wet with this. PowerShell Empire was a tool that we saw and had noted that this adversary had been utilizing, and we thought that would be a good thing to go ahead and utilize and go ahead and practice on and utilize the modules that were in PowerShell Empire. As we gained a little bit more maturity on this, we said, well, that's great. We've got Windows systems out there. They're logging to Sysmon, but there's also Linux servers out there, right? There's struts vulnerabilities out there. How do we monitor for Linux visibility? How about OS query? So we went ahead and started pulling in OS query data, and we went ahead and started pulling those pieces together and started creating visibility into our Windows information, our Linux information, and so forth. Now, about that same time, we had users that were moving more stuff to the cloud. That's my cloud there. The clouds we focused on Amazon initially, we focused on Azure initially, we moved into GCP over time, and we started looking at the different products that were out there. The products that we started focusing on were the things that people were moving their workloads to initially, right? Compute and storage. So we went and started ahead and started dipping our toes into those things. What else do we look at? Well, we also started having folks moving to 365, right? And they started moving their SharePoint there, and they started moving their Exchange there. And so we started kind of saying, well, what can we see from those different spots? 2 days ago, Mehmet was talking about Cloud IR and talked about the need to be able to see and get visibility into those cloud instances. This is an opportunity that we use to go ahead and start kind of getting visibility into what kind of logging fidelity do I have in these clouds by emulating our adversary going ahead and attacking those clouds. Now, as we move forward, we spent a couple of years doing this specific nation-state adversary, and we decided it was time to go ahead and try a new one. And I kind of took this on as a kind of a wider responsibility. And so I sat down and I started kind of racking my brain and said, okay, I've got a nation-state adversary in mind. But what can I come up with? What would be some interesting things? What would be some different things that we could kind of talk about? So I started sitting down and I broke out my threat intel reports, and I came across a Mandiant report. It was quite good. I moved over to a Microsoft report, and Microsoft was kind enough to put this specific picture in that threat report. And so I started looking at it. I'm like, okay, we got this email, and we got this link file, and we open the link file, and the actual PDF opens, but then we also go ahead and spawn off some PowerShell, and we download some Cobalt Strike, and good times ensue. And it was kind of like, yeah, this would be an interesting one to go ahead and take on. So we sat down, kind of started forming this out, started building, and started working through this emulation and building this emulation. I'm not going to spend much time on this. Everybody's heard attack this week, but one of the things that we saw at the same time is obviously attack is getting more and more of a groundswell. So I started kind of utilizing that as kind of the palette that we were going to work with. The reason I did that was that taxonomy, the taxonomy of the common way that different people within threat and IR, security ops, threat intelligence can speak. So what I did with this was took the adversary that we had, and it was kind of a combined adversary from a nation state, and put this together, and this was my palette. Okay, and this is a little bit older, obviously, because this has gotten expanded, and there's sub-techniques out there as well. But the idea here was this was kind of my starting point. And I said, okay, these are the kinds of things that if I'm going to build my emulation, I want to go ahead and start utilizing these. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and build something like a diamond model. And again, I'm not going to talk about what the diamond model is, but it was very, very helpful, particularly when we got to the point of delivery of this to our analyst, to give them something like a diamond model to give them context around the things that we were going to talk about. The danger sometimes is if you provide a very, very high-level piece of information to the analyst and say, go at it, they don't necessarily have the additional context. So we found the diamond model was a good way to contextualize that. What did we contextualize that with? Well, first thing we did was go ahead and identified goals. Everybody's got to have goals, right? So the goals, in my estimation, are kind of like, if I do nothing else in this emulation, if I can't see anything else in this emulation, here are the 5 things that I want to be able to exercise, right? So I wanted to exercise that spear phishing link. I wanted to do domain fronting, accessibility features, pass the ticket with some golden ticket, and my objective is the ntds.dit file, okay? With domain fronting, in terms of reading some of the MITRE attack techniques, things in there we're talking about using a Meek plugin to go ahead and with a Tor exit node, and I'm like, wow, that's really, really cool. But let's maybe expose our blue teamers to something else to kind of, dip their feet into this. Let's go ahead and just do some domain fronting. Maybe our adversary isn't quite that elite, and they're going to go ahead and do domain fronting, so that's kind of new and introduce that concept, but maybe not go down the Tor exit node route. Okay? So again, we'll come back to that and talking about calibrating a little bit there as you go. Accessibility features, pass the ticket, okay. Now, first thing I did was I ran into some challenges. At that point in time, Cobalt Strike was not available for sale to me or my team. We weren't going to use a cracked version. That seemed like a really bad idea. And we had just spent the past 2 years using PowerShell Empire and exercising that. So I'm not going to go back to that same well, right? I want to continue to evolve, continue to expose folks to new things. So we ended up using Metasploit. We really weren't focusing on the Metasploit modules, but we were going ahead and utilizing that. I've got the C2 there, I've got the interpreter, good enough. As we see more people moving to the cloud, right, Azure AD was starting to take more hold there. So going ahead and building an integration where somebody had an AD on site, they had an Azure AD in the cloud, and they had some sort of synchronization because not everybody just takes their AD, shuts it off, moves it to the cloud, and says, yep, we're good, right? Right? I know you guys had a long lunch and everything, but right? The idea here is that we added Active Directory sync, kind of in that transition mode, okay? And also to raise the bar a little bit more for the attackers, but also to kind of take a little bit of the, oh yeah, Windows 7 box, everybody can crack a Windows 7 box. We moved everybody to Windows 10, right? Just kind of up-level that. The teaching point that I take away from Windows 7 versus Windows 10 is if you wanted to use Windows 7, that's fine. It's important to utilize that and kind of help people understand that they need to put more tripwires, more focus on those more vulnerable systems. And it can be anything besides Windows 7, but you get the idea. In this case, we kind of up-leveled everything to Windows 10 at the time. All right, so we defined our goals. We didn't eliminate our challenges, but we established workarounds to those things. So what I did at this point was we started kind of working through and building out what this would look like. And so if you're building an emulation, there's a couple of different things you can do. At the very least, the one on the top there is kind of the bullet point method, okay? I want to get to this spot, I want to do X, I want to do Y, I want to do Z. And that's perfectly fine. And in fact, when it came to the cloud part of the attack and I had written this narrative, I kind of got to that point, I'm just like, oh, let me just do these 5 things and then I'm done, okay? So, but that's kind of the basics, if you will. The one below it was a little bit more of a narrative in terms of the description as to here's what we're going to do, here's what the MITRE attack techniques, and this is at that time, because you can see some of these techniques have been shut down, turned off, modified, enhanced. These are the techniques, and I'll tell you why that's important because we're going to come back to that in a bit, and then the commands associated with it. And then the one on the right starts getting a little bit more verbose, where we actually added the sub-techniques in there. We started adding the command lines in there with the exact command lines with some of it blurred out, so I'm not going to give away some of my indicators there. And then also the timestamps, okay? Now the timestamps are the things that we added in after the fact. Generally, you do a validation. So you run your emulation, do some validation. Did I get what I was expecting to get? Okay. We've had instances where we've gone ahead and run something. I ran a registry key, put a run key in, right? Run a task scheduler, go back in and look and say, oh, wait a second, we don't have that event. Why don't we have that event? Did we have a misconfiguration on the network that we're running this on? We've had that happen as well, okay? Those kinds of things are going to happen. You want to have those in there. The other nice thing is when you go back to these emulation scripts and these emulation narratives and you start trying to build whatever you're building, whether that's competition, whether that's training, whether that's just providing a data set to somebody to say, hey, go hunt this, being able to know where those things are, it can be very, very helpful and impactful. Okay? So having those kind of waypoints along the road can be good. Again, you don't have to do all those things, but I found it being helpful to go from the bullet point to the narrative with the commands, mapping to MITRE, adding the timestamps to it, and having the command line all there together so it's right there. Because also, if you think about it from an adversary perspective, they're probably running on an ops script as well. Maybe not to the same level, but they're going to be going, okay, I log in and I'm going to go, who am I first? Then I'm going to go ahead and ping, and then I'm going to do this and this, or whatever those things are. So, we got to the end of this. The ones in yellow were the palette that I was starting to work with, right? The ones in orange are the ones we hit the first time through. The ones in red were things that were not called out in this adversary group, but were things that I kind of sprinkled in there to kind of help me get from point A to point B to point C. And then the blues are the ones that were some of the cloud pieces, because cloud really wasn't in scope of that adversary at that point in time. But we're like, okay, yeah, good. So I kind of look at this and I go, okay, I think we did a pretty good job hitting the different tactics along the way and the different mileposts. Do we have that data in the log set that we've created? That's a separate question, right? But that's the way we go with this. So there's some more things that I can do with this adversary to exercise this. Kind of fast forward a year, right? We all moved to Zoom, right? We're all working out of the house. That's important because that also potentially changes the emulation that we're doing, and it changes the landscape of the victim organization, which I'll talk about in a bit. But you think about it from that perspective. If I had built lateral movement as a primary TTP for an adversary, and it goes workstation to workstation, that kind of flies by the wayside when we're in this state, right? So we have to modify our emulation for the environment that we work in. So came back to this, said, okay, great, Metasploit was lovely. That was my stopgap for the year, but what could I utilize otherwise, right? I'm not going to ask who all's used Covenant and what have you before, but if you haven't gotten a chance to take a look at Covenant, take a look at it. It's a very good C2. We utilize that actually the past 2 years. As I was taking a look at this and trying to figure out what else I wanted to do, we had talked to some threat intel analysts at a couple of the larger organizations. Some of the feedback we got about this adversary group was that there was a lot more movement to the cloud, a lot of movement away from custom malware, and a lot of movement towards more living off the land, if you will. So I have my little tripod there with my campfire and my kettle, and we're going to live off the land there. PowerShell continued to be out there. At the same time, we tried to up-level for the defenders by turning on script block logging, right? So we wanted to go ahead and say, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to still continue doing PowerShell attacks, but we're going to go ahead and up-level from the defense perspective too. We moved Azure from AD Sync to AD Connect. That was the preferred Microsoft manner, so we went ahead with another synchronization or another integration method there with more of our workloads already up in Azure. And then from a SQL Azure perspective, my first job out of school was a DBA. And so I've got a special place in my heart for Microsoft SQL DBA, that package. And I was like, okay, let's see what this looks like. So we took a customer database. We moved that customer database to the cloud. And when I say customer, it's something we created, but customer database to the cloud, and then started turning on the SQL auditing and says, what kind of visibility do we have around SQL? What kinds of things do we see the creates? Do we see the drops? Do we see the BCPs? What does that visibility look like in that cloud? And progress through that attack. Right? So again, changing the landscape to go ahead and accommodate these new realities. Fast forward, we have had this little thing in the news called Solarigate, right? We had the supply chain piece of this. We had these other things. As I was doing my research again there, we started coming across ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. Right? ADFS is yet another way to go ahead and utilize that Active Directory on-premise, that Active Directory in Azure, and that synchronization so I can go ahead and log in and be able to get to those assets. We heard about things called Golden SAML, and it's like, wow, this sounds really, really bad. This is really interesting, though. What can we do to see this? Because there was also these conversations about bypassing multi-factor authentication, getting into the Graph API and doing stuff there. And so it was like, okay, let's go ahead and start kind of building our emulation around these things. There's more work to C#. We still kept PowerShell around, but utilizing some more of the C# tooling that was out there as well, because we're seeing more of that from an adversary perspective. So as we're just talking about this for a couple minutes, you notice all of the different frameworks, software tools, and I didn't even talk about all these different pieces, but all of a sudden, what you can kind of see with this, talking about these different scenarios around these adversaries, is we're building up a nice corpus of understanding around what these tools do, what these tools log, what the visibility of them looks like, to be able to go ahead and say, oh, okay, if I can go ahead and find this, I can hunt for this, I can detect this, and so forth. Okay? Now, sometimes when you sign up to go ahead and present somewhere, right, you're going ahead and building your decks. And I've had this happen. This is at least the second time this happened. Whether it's the Twitter fairy or the threat intel report fairy drops something on you as you're preparing to talk about something. And so this came out from Mandiant literally, I think, 6 weeks ago, which was their analysis of the UNC 2452 merging into APT 29. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. That kind of dovetails with what we've just been talking about for the past 10 minutes. So I crack it open, start flipping through, and they had some high-level commentary there around this. And so this is kind of where I started looking at this going, okay, am I creating this, is this aligning? And they talked about varying intrusion vectors. Well, the picture on the side is their intrusion vectors. 4 of those 6 we've touched on, some of them as straight up initial access, some of them as being initial access and then a pivot to a cloud after having more information. So I was like, okay, yeah, we're doing pretty good. Heightened OPSEC, yeah, we really don't cover that because one of the things about heightened OPSEC is like getting on and turning off the logs. That kind of would defeat the whole detection point of this that we were trying to solve or address, but obviously turning on and monitoring for logging being turned off or disabled is something that would be very important to, take care of that. From a sophistication perspective, they cited on-prem to cloud movement. Yeah, we walked through that and we did that a couple of different ways. Bypassing MFA with Golden SAML and the Graph API, you absolutely did that. I'm hoping at some point here I can write it or do another thing around talking about how all that worked. The maintaining a light footprint. Remember we had talked to some different threat intel analysts, and they were not Mandiant, by the way, that had talked about moving away from custom tooling and moving to more living off the land. These are some quotes directly from the Mandiant team talking about the native Microsoft feature abuse, a lot less custom tooling there and everything else. So I was like, great, this is really kind of validating the things that we were kind of observing and kind of emulating as we went. They talked about them moving with speed and agility. We don't move with speed and agility. We were doing these things for fixed finite pieces, and again, we're not adversaries as a professional capability. Okay, we're blue teamers trying to do some of this to make everybody a little bit better. And then the last part, they talked about following the data. That was mainly around Exchange. We didn't do a lot with Exchange, mainly because One time we went ahead and tried to go ahead and capture a large corpus of mail. We realized we were going to potentially run into privacy issues around the addresses that were in that mail. Even though so much of it was spam, there was still some weirdness there that we just decided not to get into that. We did monkey with the exchange rules a little bit, right? Go ahead and take a email coming into the CEO and send it to somebody else's email address as well, just to see what you could do and what kind of fidelity of logging you could have. But those are the kinds of things that we kind of focused on. Following the data from our perspective wasn't as critical because obviously we're not trying to steal the mail, but we did stage and exfiltrate that data as well. All right, this is an eye chart. It actually, yeah, it definitely is an eye chart even up on there. This is kind of the assessment as to how we did with this adversary. So the white is the MITRE techniques that did not apply to the adversary. The lightest of the light blue are the techniques that we didn't touch. The darker and darker and darker blues are the more times that we iterated and utilized that tooling. The good news looking at this overall, again, is that we were able to hit a lot of techniques and sub-techniques across many, many steps across this. So, you know, I felt like we were kind of squeezing the juice out of the techniques and sub-techniques that this adversary was using. So I felt pretty good about that as well. So let's talk about some lessons learned here. The first thing to talk about is keeping this real. Keeping it real when you're building an emulation is always a concern, right? You want this to pass the, oh, no, there's no way that this would ever happen. The answer is yes, it would probably happen, right? You have to keep it, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? But it does have to be realistic. If anybody was in the cloud talk this morning about workloads, was it workloads? The folks were talking about a secure default configuration does not equal a secure configuration when it comes to cloud. And that's absolutely the case, right? And if I'm trying to learn GCP, I'm trying to learn Azure, I'm trying to learn AWS, I'm probably going to take a lot of defaults along the way just to get started because I don't know any better or I don't have the time. So you're going to have those misconfigurations happen. AV and EDR bypasses are out there and they happen all the time. Admins don't necessarily follow their own policies, right? Yes, you know who you are. But the idea there is that these things are going to happen, so don't stress too much about keeping it real. Those things are going to happen as you start building things out like this. Current events are fabulous. I find that works the best to go ahead and generate some of these ideas. Also keeps it real from that perspective. But it's important to figure out who is the adversary that you're going to target. Now, targeting the adversary and focusing on that, people sometimes get fixated on it has to be a perfect copy. It doesn't have to be a perfect copy, okay? And the example I like to use here is shadow copies. I talked about ntds.dit, right? To be able to get to ntds.dit, I'm going to get to a volume shadow copy as an example. What I want to be focused on is how can I detect somebody getting to a volume shadow copy? There's a bunch of different ways to get to it, right? But think about it from an outcome perspective. And again, if I'm trying to defend, if I'm trying to expose this information to hunters, I want to be able to think about how are the 5 different ways, 10 different ways that somebody could get to this thing, and then I could go ahead and identify those different things. Doing VSS admin every single time isn't going to be beneficial to the blue team. Then, of course, monitor at the endpoint, monitor at the network, try to get as much visibility as you have out there. This is a tough one. So benefit and burden, this does take time, right? This takes time away from the core activities, the core missions of the teams, right? So this is where you kind of have to balance, you know, what resources do I have, what time do I have, and what kind of benefit can I get? There's only so many initial access capabilities or ways to get at it, right? Link file spear phishing, macro, you know, there's like 8 of them out there. Is it crucial to focus on that? Woot did a talk yesterday about spear phishing, both on the kind of a blue team, red team perspective. If you want to focus on initial access, some of the things that he was doing there could be very, very valuable to be thinking about. From my perspective, I've kind of gotten to the point of let's kind of assume initial access because, again, we're talking about detection. We're talking a little bit about post-breach. We're going to assume, you know, the barbarians are inside the gates already. What can we go ahead and detect and how can we mitigate that from there, right? If your focus is outside on the initial access, that's perfectly fine. You just have to recalibrate that and be thinking about it from that perspective. From an end-to-end perspective, end-to-end, full-on APT things are a lot of fun, and they are really, really stressful, right? Because you're building these things, you're concerned about maintaining the footholds. We're also having to do this compressed, so we're not doing this over 56 days or 90 days of dwell time or things like that. But you can go ahead and do those kinds of things. But on the other hand, if you're going ahead to use this as an education or a tester or something else like that, maybe focus on a subset of tactics. right? Maybe you assume initial access has already happened. You're in an execution phase. You're going to go ahead and move a lateral movement, and you're going to go ahead and maybe make another lateral movement, and that's it. You're going to bound it. Or maybe you're going to do data collection, staging, exfiltration, and bound it, right? Making it chewable makes it a little bit easier to go ahead and do that, and it doesn't create as much stress on the organization. And then, of course, keeping it focus. What things matter to you? That's really the most important thing. If it doesn't matter to you, it doesn't matter to your organization, why are you emulating it? Okay. Test, test, test. Unit testing is fantastic. Practice, practice, practice. End-to-end is important. Something will break. These 4 things broke. Okay. I talked about 5 different adversary emulations. I had 1 a year, almost. Okay. Pivoting from Windows to Linux, that was fabulous. The gentleman who was doing the Linux piece did his piece. He lives in Texas. I did my piece. I live in Virginia. We got together in San Jose, sit down the night before to go ahead and just make sure we had everything together, and we realized we didn't have that pivot in place. Guess what we did that evening? Okay? Those kinds of things happen. The RDP through a firewall, because of some weird infrastructure pieces, ended up being this pivot through interpreter to be able to get to RDP from the attacker because I did not have a direct link to the adversary. Those kinds of things happen. You need to be thinking about those things. You need to be prepared to go ahead and have those happen. And you know what? Some of this stuff is good. The exfiltration through a firewall, real quick. We were doing FTP exfiltration. We actually had a prevention kick in and block it. We ended up building on the fly a DNS exfiltration. We kicked that in. That started getting blocked, but it was good because those things popped up in the log stream as well to be able to see what are your tooling showing in there as well as things that are happening, right? Adversaries make mistakes. We utilize that to capitalize on those kinds of things as well. Provide some curveballs to your blue team, right? This is for their benefit, but if you keep spoon-feeding them mimikatz.exe every single time, it's not going to help them, right? The 1 year I took Mimikatz, we used Kiwi, right, for Metasploit. We used encoded PowerShell, serving up Mimikatz, and we used good old-fashioned Mimikatz at the command line, but it was obfuscated, recompiled, right? Get them focusing on the behaviors, but if you have to up-level people, go ahead and give them the softballs, the easier pieces of it, but then keep tweaking it a little bit more to make it a little bit harder. You have those data sets, hopefully. If you're doing this, you're storing those data sets. You could always replay them later for them. To recon or not recon. I don't care about recon unless I want to highlight sloppy tradecraft. Again, that depends on your organization, but I do care about recon once I get a foothold, because chances are when they get a foothold, they don't necessarily know where they're at. I think that was a theme I heard earlier this week as well. The first thing you're going to do is start poking around. That's the place to go ahead and start focusing on the recon pieces of it. Again, that's a good way to shave a little bit of time and energy off of this. Virtual, physical, or cloud? Where do I build my infrastructure? The answer, after multiple years of doing this, is I don't care. Okay? Do it where it is cost effective for you and it is easy for you. Back to that struggle with keeping it real. For a while there, I was concerned about, man, it says VMware in my network stack. Man, it says AWS in my network stack. It says Google in my network stack. What am I going to do? Don't worry about that. Okay? That's part of the, okay, look, we're going to accept that those pieces are in place, but what we're trying to do is provide an always-on, always-available environment that's going to just work, right? I ran a hybrid environment. That ADFS environment had Active Directory with Azure connecting to Azure AD, and that worked much better than me running it on my laptop in a virtual machine and having the SOC call me and saying, what exactly are you doing on your virtual machine on this laptop? Because, boy, it sure looks a little bit odd. Right? Take the burden off the SOC, take the burden off of yourself, and if you put it in the cloud, that's fine. If you put it on your extra machines or some VMs, that's fine too. Just do whatever feels right there. Now, we talked a lot about the adversary side of this. Let's talk really briefly about the character development on the other side of this. Okay? When you're building your victim organization, and you could potentially launch these things, obviously, against your own organization. That seems pretty bold, but you could do that. We stood up a fictional organization, but the thing that's important to know about this is that the goal is not to shame the organization, and the goal is not to shame the individual. Okay? There are people's roles who have to open things that are coming off the internet, and things sometimes bad will happen. Right? We want to use representative personas. Everybody has a finance organization, accounting organization, marketing organization, IT, R&D. Representative personas was kind of the way we went through this, and that worked very, very well, and also it kind of helped keep our scenarios relatively tight rather than worrying about 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people. Those representative personas can be those force multipliers for those different people. And then when things change over time, you're going to have continuity checks. When we went to remote, right, we had to worry about that. When we went to, we decided to look at Kubernetes. Okay, again, going into some more of the cloud technologies. We put a developer into our storyline, so they were going to work on spinning up a Kubernetes environment, and of course, default versus secure, right? So those are the kinds of things that you can do with this from a character perspective as well. So, a couple last thoughts here. You're not going to attain perfection, okay? For starters, you probably won't have the custom malware if you're trying to go ahead and go after that. You may not have every tool available to you. Just find the workarounds. That's okay. Stay focused on those goals. Again, even if I don't build out the whole narrative, what are the goals? What are the things I want to achieve? Focus on defensive side visibility, and then the risk of diminishing returns is real. Okay? I've built at least 2 applications that were customer databases and what would be the Solaragate compromised application. Right? Basically a trigger point. The amount of time I put into those applications for the amount of logging and visibility I got back out of it was teeny tiny. We didn't do CI/CD, but I just didn't get as much out of that as I did. So just be careful as to where am I going to start my scenario, where do I want to end it, what am I trying to achieve, and then calibrate that part of it because, again, this can become a tremendous amount of time if you don't do it right. Last thoughts. Focus on the goals. The techniques will come along, whether they're attack, Varus, whatever. Leverage your threat intelligence. If you don't have threat intelligence, open source is better than nothing, but make sure the adversary fits you and your organization. Individual techniques are great, but if you can go ahead and put them together and put sequences of them together, hey, first this happens, then this happens, then this happens, that up-levels that blue team to understand those pieces fitting together. And then, most importantly, identify those gaps in the data. If you're doing something and you go, wait a second, I see this, and I'm missing this, you need to go ahead and improve your logging to create that visibility so I can hunt, so I can detect. Focus on that upper end of the pyramid. Right? For adversary emulation, the lower half I can change very, very easily. The TTPs are tough to change for the adversary. They're tough for you to detect, but you can go ahead and overcome that. With that, I think I have a few minutes left for questions. Thank you for having me here, and hopefully this was helpful.
Yes, thank you, John. We have a few minutes for questions or comments. Please approach the microphones. We have, I think, 4 in the room. So if you have anything. No, he was a partner. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hey, really good talk. Really, really good talk. I don't know if the question is such, but maybe I can just give you a quick overview. I lead a security response team, CSOC, CSOC, detection engineering. There's obviously conflict between detections being onboarded, people creating detections, kind of following some of the methodology you outlined. They're not really eating drone dog food, and they don't necessarily understand whether the new detections are analytically tractable. There's all these kind of conflicts, right, incentive conflicts, and we're struggling with how to do that, right? Whether a detection would make sense, there's a risk, and it should have human eyes, and how do you treat that with a first in, first out queue? Do you just keep passing them in and just hope that someone gets there eventually? Do you have strict guidelines around alert fidelity? Do you have different queues, some that are best effort, whereas others are, SLA driven? Yeah. So I'm kind of ranting here a small bit, but I just kind of wanted to dump some of that on you and just kind of get your thoughts on how you see that working well.
Yeah, that's a tougher one and a larger conversation, I think. If you feel like it's something, I was going to say, I mean, the dumping it in and saying best effort, rather than just getting rid of it, that's certainly not, that's certainly valid, that's certainly okay from that perspective. I guess the question I'd have is that if you have that many things that are creating that many false positives and that much noise, then clearly the fidelity isn't there, right? If it's something that you can go ahead and use and maybe qualify as hunting queries, for lack of a better way to describe it, and you say, okay, we're going to go ahead and use these as being, these are not the best of the best alerts. These are not the ones that I can give to my tier ones, but these are things that I could go ahead and say, hey, we're going to save these. Don't do it Friday afternoon, right? But Wednesday afternoon, we're going to go ahead and kind of focus on these and work through this. with the objective of saying, okay, 50% of these were false positives. Why were they false positives, right? 50% of them were good and interesting. Why were they interesting? And then utilize that to refine those. You're going to have some things that are going to be hunting queries for sure. Right? It's just kind of like these are not going to be winners. They're not going to hit it out every single time. But on occasion, I'll go ahead and get something. If you use it like that, that might be a good way to do it. That also then gets into how those alerts are being tagged, so that are they ending up at a tier? If they're ending up at tier 1 queue, that's problematic, right? So the first thing to do is you've got to figure out a way to get out of those. From a tech perspective, that depends as to what tech you're running to be able to do that. But maybe to me, that might be something where I'd go ahead and just say, you know what, we're going to define these as hunting queries. We're going to work through them. We're going to try to determine why they're hunting queries, if they actually even are at that point. And then if they're not, retire them. If they are, we're going to tag them as such. And then, we'll figure out a method and a timing to run those and to look at those from there. So that's me, my 2 cents.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, time is up, but anyone else wants a final question or comment? No.
Yep. And I'll be sticking around here, so if anybody has any other questions and wants to talk offline, particularly about the sad-timey music, happy to do that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much.